All right, welcome back for another episode of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks. I'm your host, Carl Storms, here with you once again with our ever so gracious guest host for this series, John Pearson. How you doing, John?
Doing pretty good. How's it going? Glad to
Doing
still be here.
wonderful. Yes, you know, every episode you pretend like you're not going to be here, but we would never let you go. You're a superstar. That's
Oh,
what
I
you are.
appreciate it. Always
And
glad to hang out.
and our episode guest, Ehsan. How you doing?
Pretty good. Sorry, I muted myself.
That's the beauty of
Pretty
these
good.
live.
Yeah, pretty good. Life's good so far. Busy, but good.
That's what we like to hear. So for those of you that maybe are just hopping in for the first time, catching wrenches, gadgets, and hacks, the idea behind this podcast is, we're a technology podcast about the curious and creative that work in AECO and go beyond. And we decided we were going to put this together, that we were going to do it in the idea of having series for this podcast. And this particular series, this first series, is about technology, innovation, and those that are curious on and off the clock. And we couldn't think of a better guest for this than Ehsan. So for those of you who don't know, he works at Rand McNeil doing Rhino-Inside Revit, or just Rhino-Inside, I think. And of course is the father of pyRevit. So he's got innovation all wrapped up for sure. But now I think I'll turn it over to Ehsan to tell us a little bit about himself before we hop into the joys of what he does.
Thanks. Very short story. I moved to the US from Iran back in 2010, and I had studied already architecture back in Iran. So when I moved here, I was like, okay, this is a different market, all that kind of stuff. Let's pursue architecture again. And I got my license in Texas first, and then moved to Oregon. And then about the time that I moved to Oregon, the company that I started working for, they were using Revit. And they asked me, have you ever used Revit? I was like, well, on a small project, maybe. So I started fiddling with it, and very quickly, coming from AutoCAD, I kind of realized that, hey, there's a programming environment missing. We can't really create scripts anymore. And that was a major drawback for me using the software. So that's how sort of like the pyRevit project started. I got hacked in a bunch of Python scripts and whatnot to do area analysis and stuff like that. And there was already a project called Revit Python Shell, and I was using that for a while. And then after a while, I had like a collection of like 30, 40 scripts. And I'm like, okay, this is getting a little tedious to go open the file, run it, and then open the file, run it, keep repeating those tasks. So I ended up creating a bootstrap thing that would load those scripts inside of Revit ribbon as buttons, so I can just click on them. And I remember I published it on GitHub, and a while later, Guy Talarico, one of my friends, he was the first person that emailed me about it. And he's like, well, nobody writes programs like this. This is a giant monolithic, 500 lines that nobody can understand what it's doing. I was like, oh, okay, so people are actually interested. Let's just redo this again. And that was pyRevit version 1, the first time that I rewrote the original pyRevit. And we, after that, started publishing it and adding more tools, all that kind of stuff. So that's my history of just coming to the US, architecture, pyRevit. And then by end of 2019, I got super lucky to join McNeil and start working on Rhino-Inside and the script editor. So my biggest project at McNeil is actually not Rhino-Inside, but Rhino-Inside is really Kike's baby, basically. So Jaffe and Kike, two of my coworkers, they're the ones that are maintaining it and improving it and all that kind of stuff. The only thing I do at this point is I make the icons for the components. But my main project inside of Rhino has been, in the past 4 years, the new script editing environment inside of Rhino. That's a kind of short story. It's been very challenging 4 years, but also a lot of learning.
That sounds pretty cool. And the script editor, I've seen a few posts you had just recently on LinkedIn, with getting it installed, getting NumPy and things like that installed inside of it. So this script editor is going to allow you to edit things like Python scripts directly inside of Rhino. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So Python Rhino had this, now I can call it legacy infrastructure. This legacy infrastructure that had a script editor inside of Grasshopper with a C# component and a IronPython component. There was also a VB script component, but I'm not quite sure how popular that is, at least at this point. And it had another editor inside of Rhino itself, so you could edit scripts and whatnot. But what happened was that when they decided, I joined McNeil, it was about the time that they decided to make Rhino run on .NET Core. And some of those infrastructure couldn't really carry over to this one. We kind of had to rewrite some parts of it. And it was about the same time that Steve, one of the product managers at McNeil, who was like, well, we were thinking about putting Rhino Python 3 inside of Rhino. I was like, can I do that? I had no idea how would that work, but at the time it was really interesting to me. This is something that I always wanted to do inside of Revit. And knowing that Rhino inside Revit existed, I was like, okay, if I focus all my energy right now for the next couple of years inside of Rhino, this will carry all this infrastructure inside of all the other host applications too. And then at that point, we can figure out like what we're going to do with Revit and whatnot. So that's been my sort of like passion project for the past 4 years now, which the script editor, completely fresh, runs. It looks exactly the same inside of Rhino, inside of Grasshopper, on Windows and on Mac. And you get to run Python 3, Python 2, modern C#, which is C# scripting basically. So you don't really need to define a script instance class and all that kind of stuff. It's much more dynamic. And then with support for package management. So if you want to use NumPy, numerical analysis, libraries, those kind of stuff inside of Rhino, now you can do that. And it makes, one of the really nice things about it is that it makes, at least it attempts to make all of these very easily accessible. So one of the things that we did was that we came up with this convention that you put the requirements for your script inside of the script itself. So wherever that script goes, it knows what it needs. And the Rhino scripting infrastructure will handle installing that and running it on.
Very cool. So I'm looking at one of your images now, but that line that says requirements, that can be like a comma separated list of requirements. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, you can have a comma separated list of requirements. You can specify basically the package. What is it? Pip package spec. So you can put, equals or greater than whatever version, all that kind of stuff. You can put those information in there and it would get passed directly to pip. You can also, because you're running inside a .NET environment, you can also put NuGet package references inside of your Python script.
That's cool.
And it would download the DLLs and then you can load them and reference them and all that.
And this all happens on the fly when you ship a script to, oh, that's epic. That's freaking awesome.
And then we do have a mechanism in the script editor that you can publish. I tend to call them published scripts. So you get to publish your scripts inside of Rhino as a Rhino command in a Rhino plugin. And the components that you make inside of your Grasshopper definitions, you get to publish them as script components in a Grasshopper plugin. So it will generate Rhino and Grasshopper plugins that will run on Mac and Windows from a collection of scripts that you have. And then basically it embeds those scripts inside of it and handles the installation of the packages, all that kind of stuff on the end.
That's very cool. And then you said part of this move towards you focusing so much time on this new editor is the move to .NET Core for Rhino.
Yeah, that was one of the main. Yeah, there were two triggers. One was the move to .NET Core. The problem was that the old editor had this Avalon, I think, control inside of it. That was the actual text editor, and that didn't have a .NET Core counterpart. So we were like, okay, so what are we gonna do? And when I started at McNeil, there were already a project to start using Monaco, which is the one that the control that VS Code uses. So if you in Rhino 8, if you look at the legacy editors, they have been switched to use Monaco because we had to carry all of those inside of the new Rhino 8. It's just that, we decided it's a good time to clean this up. The other part of the problem was that none of these were really available on the Mac. Like Mac had an edit Python script and a Grasshopper component, but the problem was that it wasn't much of an editor. It was basically just a text box.
I gotcha. Yeah, that's one of the things, like human UI for Grasshopper Mac compatibility has been kind of interesting because it uses WPF, I think.
Yeah.
So it's always this ongoing thing. And I mean, can I just say how much I appreciate that Rhino runs on a Mac as well? That's freaking awesome. So cool. It's like really neat. And then the move to .NET Core is huge. Dynamo 3.0 has moved to .NET 8 at this point. So like, and that's a struggle as well. So the fact that Rhino's done that is pretty neat in my opinion.
Yeah, the biggest part of the problem was that like I've been thinking about whether Autodesk will move Revit to Mac as well. But it's the problem really is that it's not just the .NET component of it. The .NET component was obviously like the first thing, but the team at McNeil, I wasn't part of this, but the team at McNeil they did a tremendous job removing all the Win32 APIs inside of Rhino that they were used for like controls and all that kind of stuff. Rhino 8 effectively has a new UI basically created on Eto. Majority of Windows, all of that have been sort of like recreated. And we have the person who is the original developer of Eto at McNeil. So he sort of like created all these like wrapper libraries and stuff like that. So basically Grasshopper that's running in a Mac is the same code that's running on Windows. It uses system Windows drawing, but it's actually doing all those drawings on Mac. It's actually
Very
quite
cool.
impressive. And I like it that the Mac
Yeah,
is fundamentally a different software from Rhino 7 for Mac. It's just it runs so much faster. It has support for Metal, and it's a different beast.
no, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we're getting a little off topic, I guess probably, but I use a Mac for video editing a lot,
Mm.
and I'll record everything on my Windows machine because I'm a Revit user primarily. But like, man, I just wish more things supported Mac just as a
Yeah.
Mac user on the side, you know?
Just out of
Very cool.
curiosity, John, what company makes Mac?
Oh yeah, Apple. We mention them every episode.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're trying to get that sponsorship going.
It's always an accident. I always start
Yeah,
going off on it.
it just happens to, as we're talking about it, it comes into play, but that, that's handy. One of
That's
the things that I found very interesting about, the story, just what we're hearing, aside that the two of you are talking way over my head, and I love it, is the idea that when you were telling your story, Ehsan, about how you sort of ended up where you are in the passion project that you're working on, is that coding wasn't part of that. You were an architect, you came to the States, you got back into being an architect, but at no point did we talk about coding, and now we're like sort of deep into that world. So
That's
how did
true.
that part come to be?
Yeah, so since I was a kid, my dad was a telecommunication engineer. Well, I mean, he's still alive, but he's not an engineer anymore. So since I was a kid, I always played in his shop, fixing things and making things and all that kind of stuff. And he was the first person to teach me electronics. And back then it was just analog electronics. There wasn't really that much digital stuff available to me. But after I finished my school, architecture school, I had a friend that studied electrical engineering, and he taught me how to use the digital electronics, microcontrollers, those kind of stuff. And I started working with him. So like there was a thread of programming since I was a kid, and I sat in front of the computer the first time, up to this point. But it's just happened to be that, because of different circumstances, I ended up studying architecture right in Iran, and then continuing that here, it was a sort of like a nice merge of the two. Now I'm pretty happy that I have like the two different sets of skills that kind of got combined together at some point.
For sure. And so Python being where you landed, was that because of the existence of the Revit Python shell?
So I knew Python before that. I used Python
Oh,
as
okay.
I used Python. So I started learning Python, I think, when I moved to the US, like about 2010. And I used it as a
Okay.
basically Swiss Army knife. I remember I had a bunch of scripts that because I had to send pretty standard emails to my boss about like potential projects and whatnot. And I had scripts like automating all of this, and I would drag a bunch of PDF files and it would
Oh,
directly
that's
email me.
awesome.
And then when I started working with Revit, I was like, okay, so I guess I could use Python with this. And I found the Revit Python project, Revit Python shell project. And that's how they kind of got merged together.
That's very cool. That's a cool history of it. Automating some of those things like email is always kind of a fun origin
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
I think something else that came from telling us about how you landed where you are. You mentioned that the last 4 years you've sort of spent working on that, updating this new editor for Rhino-Inside. I guess my question then is that you kind of landed to do what you want to do. As you mentioned, you put up your hand and said, hey, I'll do that. And you've kind of spent 4 years doing what you wanted to do. Can that be a double-edged sword that, what you want to do is what you're doing? So you're like, I'm kind of there. I'm kind of doing that. So there's something's not right. You know, how does that play
Well,
out?
so the thing is, like every day that I'm working on this stuff, I'm loving it, right? I like the creative aspect of it, problem solving aspect of it, supporting the customer, like talking to the customers and trying to figure out people's problems online on the forums. That's probably one of my most favorite things. The part that I did not know was that when I wasn't an advanced Rhino user when I joined McNeil. I probably am still the one that knows Rhino the least, like among my colleagues. But the problem, what I sort of like walked into was that I did not realize at the time that I'm changing an infrastructure that have existed for 15 years, and I'm basically rebooting it. And that caused a lot of sort of like, bug reports and feedback and those kind of stuff. And there were things that if I had been an advanced Revit user and Rhino user, I would have picked them up earlier. But during this whole process, I realized, oh, wow, okay, so people do this with this script editor that I had no idea. So now I have to rework the things that I've done to make it adopt that pattern. So just making sure that I'm not breaking too many things in this new infrastructure has been one of the biggest problems of this whole project. It's just, it feels like I started thinking that I'm building a new building, but somewhere in the middle, I was like, okay, so there's an existing building that's been there for 15 years, and I have to
There you go.
rework this new building inside of that existing building.
You got to work around this historic building that's like barely held up.
Yeah, and people love it, and it's like,
people love that building.
Yeah,
they've had it around forever.
They love the good things about it. They love the things that they hate about it still. So you have to, like, if it's a behavior that I like to change, I still have to keep it around. Although, like, I don't think it should be like that, but it's a bug is a feature at that point.
It's definitely an interesting balancing act when you're trying to help maintain things that people already have around with any kind of scripting or automation in our industry. So like, having a project like you have right now, like people have like, hundreds of scripts that they're expecting to work still, sometimes people are a little unreasonable too, like just to be fair, but like it's definitely an interesting side of the coin that you don't really plan for until you start sending things out for people to use, right?
The human aspect of it was also very interesting. Like, this is something that I never have had in my job. There was a time in, last year-ish that I was like working and I was coming to work every day, and it was just a barrage of negative comment and just, feedbacks on the forum and just post that this doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. And I kind of had to learn how to not see that, not see the emotions, and go to beyond that and see the actual facts and what the problems are, and be able to log those and be sort of like systematic about this to be able to tackle and get these stuff fixed. I'm happy, like, at this point, the majority of those bugs are fixed. It still has bugs and differences from the old infrastructure, but it's fairly usable at this point, considering the complexity that it has. Like, just the fact that, I have to run Python 3 in an environment, in a .NET environment with all its requirements. Like, we had to do a lot of core changes to how Python net works. It's the same project that Dynamo basically effectively uses to put Python 3 inside of Dynamo. But we had to do a lot of changes to that to make it work the way we wanted it to work in Rhino.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even in Dynamo, it's C Python 3, and like most people are still trying to use IronPython 2.7 in Dynamo just because they don't want to migrate, because they have all these scripts that they don't want to change, right? So it's definitely a complex thing. And then I guess another question for you is, with Rhino-Inside, now you're thinking of it being inside of something like Revit on top of inside of Rhino. There's like these layers of complexity that you guys are balancing in that case for sure.
And one of the lucky things for me was that because I came from that background, I had that in mind when I was working on the script editor. So the script editor has this mechanism inside of it that's called platforms. Normally, when you're running inside of Rhino, the only platform that it knows is Rhino. But when it goes on top of Revit, we haven't implemented that yet because I want to make sure that the editor inside of Rhino is stable enough. But at some point, we'll switch that on, and it would know Revit also as a platform, which means that the Grasshopper component inside of Grasshopper, the script component, will know Revit data types. So you get to convert those and make changes to those and provide features that are sort of like somewhat related to the platform that it's using. What I'm hoping to build at some point is that you can export Rhino and Grasshopper plugins from the script editor right now with your scripts. When that platform is active, you would be able to use publish Revit plugins with your scripts from that script editor and load them inside of Revit. But it will require Rhino-Inside, but still it's a decent infrastructure. We'll see,
Cool.
if we get there or not. But like, it started with all these ideas in my head.
Silence is because my mind is blown right now from thinking about that and how that works its way through. And the idea that you're doing all this stuff, you're doing it at work, it's great, you love it, every day that goes to work is a good thing. And then you have this side project, this passion project of this little thing called, pyRevit that has become, a darling of the Revit industry that we hear about all the time. I work with Jean-Marc, who is a big proponent for pyRevit as
He's
well.
the
So
he's the primary maintainer of pyRevit at this point.
I hear
He
about a
holds
lot
all the
through him.
keys.
Well, and that's the other thing about pyRevit that's so cool is that because of how you created it and gestated it and it came out, and that it is something that other people can not only help you with, but have actually done that. I know what John has talked about with Dynamo, it's open source. People can sort of get in there and help out, but they talk about it, but they don't necessarily do it. But we're seeing a little bit more of that inside the pyRevit.
Yeah, I
One of
mean,
the best things that happened. I'm sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
I
no,
was
you
gonna
go.
just gonna say real quick. One of the best things that happened was that when I joined McNeil, I was talking to Scott Davidson, which is one of my really good friends, and also sort of like a product manager, marketing, all that kind of. He does pretty much everything at McNeil. I was talking to him, and he's like, "Okay, so how many people do you use pyRevit?" I was like, "I don't know. I don't collect emails." He's like, "Well, where do they get help when they want help about pyRevit?" I'm like, "They email me." I'm like, and he's like, okay, so he showed me discourse and the Rhino forum. He's like, you need something like this, and I kind of got that set up a couple of years ago, and that was incredibly helpful. And it's just, it's been people actually joining it. I got to talk closer with the people that are already new, and people ask questions. Most it's basically I don't really do much on PyRevit at this point anymore. If there's a community of developers now, Jean-Marc is sort of like driving the meetings, and he's pushing the releases button and make sure that PRs get merged and all that kind of stuff. We have started meeting monthly. I think about 3 months ago. We already have 3 meetings out there that we record and put on the YouTube channel and stuff like that. So it's sort of like evolving to be a little bit of a community in there. There's a big change that's coming is the change to .NET Core, obviously, that we have to work on.
Very cool. Yeah, and I mean the community's huge, so like same thing with anything. I have people email me about like my Dynamo packages, and I'm like, go post it on the forum, please. Just because like there being history of that same question is always so valuable. So the fact that you guys have Discourse set up is huge, and then just GitHub as well, and
Yeah,
having it all open source has really fostered that community. So like
yeah.
when you first started pyRevit, was open source like your immediate gut reaction? Like was that like, it has to be open source?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I decided to learn programming. We learned a little bit of quick basic in GW basic, if you remember those back in school. And I was like, okay, this is great. And I picked up a C programming book it's called the KNR by Kernighan and Ritchie. Dennis Ritchie and Brian Kernighan wrote that book. And I started learning about that and the Unix operating system and the history of it and all that kind of stuff. And I always loved the fact that at the University of Berkeley, at some point, you would pay them and they would put all this software on a roll and they would send it to you. And, just the way it wasn't very corporate. It was open way of like sharing all of that. And then obviously the history with Linux that happened, the Python itself, all of that. So I always loved that. And I was like, okay, it really doesn't really cost that much to replicate software. So as long as one person makes it, you can just share it after that. Obviously, in the real world, it's not really as easy as that. You still have to, a group of people that maintain that. You get pretty complicated problems, all that kind of stuff that needs to be solved. But open source has been always a passion
Very cool.
project of mine.
That's awesome. And I know it's appreciated that it's open source. I mean, like you said, people are able to contribute, and like as a consultant too, we have a lot of people ask about tools a lot of the time. And when it's open source, we're able to say, oh yeah, it's fine to use because we can see what they're doing, So it's always really appreciated from the community as well. On that same note, open source is kind of hard a lot of the time because like people are like, oh, that's just free always. Everything's
Yeah.
free. All the help's free. All of this, and it gets weird, but it's just I think AEC is still evolving to where they understand what that means as well.
Yeah. Getting people to, so I had this conversation with somebody a long time ago, and he said, my question for him was that, so when you work with a group of people, if they don't follow what you're trying to do, is it my fault that they don't follow, or is it their fault? And it was like, it's nobody's fault. You just have to follow You just have to find the term that I'm blanking on the term that he used. They basically have to sign up for what you're trying to do. You have to tell them, and if they sign up, enrollment. That's the term they use. So it's the question of enrollment. If they enroll, then you're fine. And it's been a pretty interesting journey to find enrollment for pyRevit. They have to be out there enough, long enough for people to make tools, for people to learn how Revit API works, all that kind of stuff. You can learn all the infrastructure. They have to create their own projects, like learn how GitHub works, all that kind of stuff, to get to a point that we have a really decent group of people with lots of experience maintaining a tool set like this. Which is I appreciate it a lot.
It's always interesting because your amount of users is always going to outnumber your amount of people actually developing towards it. So it's like a really weird realm to be in. It's interesting to see happen just because, speaking like from my experience working with the Dynamo team on stuff, a lot more people use Dynamo than have ever had a pull request to the Dynamo repo, so it's just like, or even submitted issues. Even getting issues submitted by people sometimes is difficult. So it's kind of it's a definitely interesting thing.
It's funny that you say that, because the idea in pyRevit is the same way. Dynamo is in that same boat, is that these tools allow people to do things they can't do with a native product, in this case, Revit. And so by giving them the voice, and ergo the way to improve a function, and then everyone has that one thing they want to do inside of Revit that they can't do, and now they have these tools that be able to do that. So you've created this community that's growing, and people by extension are getting better at Python and learning the code and all these sort of other things that come with it, because the tool that they pay their bills with didn't do that one thing they wanted it to do. And that's got to sort of feel good as well, from being able to empower these people with this tool to improve their workflow.
It's definitely an interesting thing. Oh, go for it.
No, I was just going to say that hacking aspect of it is the one that we generally love the most. To have a set of tools that lets us create our own flavor of tools on top of them, basically.
For sure. And I mean, I think the first time I heard of pyRevit, it was for the hatch tool. I think that was the first time I heard of it. Someone's like, oh, there's a hatch tool and that tool. And I'm like, oh, cool. And that's probably a lot of people's introduction, is they're like, pyRevit has a hatch tool. So it's just kind of funny how that works.
If I want to pinpoint one tool that put pyRevit on the map, it was the pattern tool, which was quite, I think like I'll put it in like pyRevit 3 or something like that. So it was quite a while after pyRevit was out there. But
yeah, I mean,
that touched the sweet spot in the industry, and they're like, great, we needed this.
Yeah, and it's one of those functions, like Carl said, like you're like, why the heck doesn't Revit have this? Like, what in the world? And then you just meet that pain point, like, and the adoption grows like crazy. So it's definitely, yeah, if you had any analytics behind that, I bet that's probably the tool that drew people in the most.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Just by the sheer number of questions. And I remember when I started talking about the pattern tool, there was a massive spike in the number of downloads. That's the only metric that I had. I was getting the download numbers from GitHub. How many times people downloaded that exe installer or something like that. And I was like, oh wow, okay, we're in different territory now.
Hatch pattern struck a chord.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And I mean, I also think it's kind of interesting in pyRevit's regard that Carl kind of hinted at this. A lot of people do depend on it, like a day-to-day kind of situation. That's like an interesting realm you've gotten into with pyRevit. I mean, Eric Fritz, he has a whole course now for coding in Revit, and it's based on pyRevit. Like that's a pretty big infrastructure built on top of that. How has that felt over the years for you, making something that people largely depend on? Is that something that like you like, how do you feel about it, like that it's used so widely?
Obviously, I'm pretty happy and proud that I a portion of what I made had such an impact. Obviously, like since I started it, a lot more people have developed components and contributed to the code and all that kind of stuff. It still makes me nervous these days, like especially with .NET Core kind of approaching. I'm like, I know there's so many companies that are using this as their core deployment platform. Like, their whole tool chain is deployed on top of pyRevit. And if I don't have a working version for their 2025 Revit, then this is going to be a big problem. So it still makes me like nervous that, how much it is out there and how much any of these changes could cause problems. But it makes me a little happier that at least a bigger group of people are part of the maintainers now. It's not just me that making those decisions. And we get, a whole lot of support.
Yeah, you have
also,
a group of people who depend on it, who are contributing to it. So like if something happens, then they hurt too. So that's kind of it's good to have them on the hook, kind of.
Yeah. And it's more appropriate because, like, at least in the past 4 years, I haven't touched really Revit that much, like an architect on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of these guys, have just, better feedback. They're close to where the problems are.
Does that mean we're going to see a pyRhino?
So I actually started that project last year when I was in TT Core conference. I started that, and I kind of want to make it use the existing new scripting infrastructure. So it, just like pyRevit would support all the languages that the scripting environment supports, all that kind of stuff. The one thing that had sort of made me stop, and well, the two things, really the bugs that I had to fix, and also in Rhino we have to clean up a little bit of those APIs that are related to creating ribbons and buttons and all that kind of stuff in there. Revit has a pretty decent API related to the different combination of buttons and all that kind of stuff that you can create in Revit ribbons. In Rhino is sort of like a little more traditional. It's toolbar based, so everything's like a button that you click on, and those buttons have a right click and a left click option, and each one of them is basically a macro. The setup is quite different from how Revit is. I thought about like maybe put all the tools inside panel because we can have docked panels inside of Rhino. So it's still that part is still in progress for me to kind of figure out how do I want to expose all these tools there. There was also something about Maya that I really liked a lot. Maya was basically a database and a scripting language and a whole bunch of like, engines, like the physics engine and all that kind of stuff that were built and accessible to that API. So when you open Maya, it would go to its script folder and start running those scripts. And those scripts are the one that actually creates the whole UI and put the viewports where they are and create the properties panel and all that kind of stuff in there. And I've been like thinking about this, like maybe it would be cool to have a user scripts folder like this, that every time you open Rhino, it would run a bunch of those scripts and it would configure it exactly the way you want it, and it would add the commands that you want it, all that kind of stuff. Now Rhino has pretty good like user interface configurations, and its user interface is not very complicated. It's very uniform with like toolbars and panels basically that you could use. So yeah, I don't know, like I got ideas about improvements like this.
Very cool. We're getting close to the half hour, but before we stop and before I ask you the famous last question, I do have one other question that's not related to any of this, but just from an Instagram post of yours that I saw. But you posted that you had got the Analogue Pocket. What are your thoughts?
Oh man!
Oh my god! It's a magnificent piece of. So okay, do you know what's the major difference between Analogue Pocket and basically everything else that's out there?
I don't.
Okay, so Analogue Pocket is everything else that we have. There's a whole bazillion these retro console gamings that you can get online. Almost every single one of those have a normal standard CPU in them, and they would run emulators. And the emulators are pretty good. They're really good at emulating the original console hardware. Analogue Pocket is fundamentally different architecture. It uses an FPGA. FPGAs are field programmable gate arrays. So Analogue Pocket has a main core that has its own API, the hardware API basically, right? And it has this FPGA, it's a big FPGA inside of this that you could load your own programs on. If you define in the real world, in the normal world of computers, if you define a program as a set of instructions that a CPU will execute, the CPU has those set of instructions predefined inside of it. So we call it like x86 architecture, or like AMD architecture, ARM architecture, all of that. Different architectures, different sets of instructions. FPGA is basically a bunch of gates, ands and ors and XORs and those kind of stuff available on a chip that you could dynamically rewire to create your own logic board. So instead of emulating a 6502 CPU, you will rewire an FPGA to be the 6502 CPU. And it would effectively run any of those programs. That's why in an Analogue Pocket, you would talk about ROMs, like each one of them, cores. that each one of them is a core. The core is the binary stream that you load into that FPGA on the Analogue Pocket, and it would run that for you. And the nicest thing about it is that the hardware connections give you direct access to the port that's on the back of it. So you can put the Game Boy cartridge, Game Boy Color cartridge, Game Boy Advance cartridge. You can create your own converters, like somebody creating a core, because you have full access to the hardware and those pins on the port. You can create your own custom converter to read, I don't know, NES games on it if you want to. So it's pretty unlimited in like what it can really do. There's a music app on it now that you could compose like beats and music and all that kind of stuff, and you can directly connect it to other media devices and stuff like that also. It's a pretty cool product they came up with.
Really awesome. So like you insert a cartridge in, and it's basically, it's not just emulating, it's like I am an NES now.
Yeah, exactly.
That is awesome. Yeah, I've been eyeing these for a while as well, because I saw, I don't know what color you got, but I've someone I follow on Twitter got one of like the red ones that came out, like the limited edition.
Yeah.
Like, man, I want one of these things.
They do look very cool.
It's a very cool piece of hardware. I do have that one that I absolutely love, and there's another one that from a Portland company is called Panic, and the game console is called Playdate, and it's this tiny yellow thing with a crank on the side. That the crank is a form of an input, so they use that very nicely inside the games. They've got good ideas about how you could use that in a game. Like there's a game that has you basically effectively move time forward or backward using that crank, and you can go back and forward in the game. A cool idea.
That's so cool.
Very cool. Well, I'm glad I asked, because that's way more than I thought I was going to get out of it. I also saw that on the Analog one that they also put out G Studio, so you can create your own game right inside of the studio to put on one of those.
Yeah. GB Studio, Game Boy Studio is an application that you can create your own Game Boy games, Game Boy Color, but it can output a full Game Boy ROM basically in its binary. So then you get to load it on any other Game Boy emulator or Game Boy hardware, or anything like that. Analogue Pocket has an option so you can directly load that game from the game output of Game Boy Studio.
That's very cool. And then I'm seeing on here that they even sell like a Super Nintendo one, or they used to, and they have an N64 one coming out. So I'm like, I just entered my stuff in their notification list, because I have a stack of N64 cartridges in my closet. It's not my N64, but man, some of my favorite consoles.
Very cool. Very cool.
I'm playing the original Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening on the Game Boy.
Very nice.
It's crazy how cool they were.
So ahead of the time.
Yeah, the games that we all played, like I don't know if we could capture some of that for the first time again,
Yeah.
For me, it was always Ocarina of Time on N64. That game was just epic.
GoldenEye.
Yep. GoldenEye, hours and hours on that thing.
Yep. For sure.
I basically jumped from, because my console when I was a kid, I had a Famicom, which was the original Japanese Nintendo entertainment system. Basically, NES was the one I think that they made for the outside of Japan market. So I was using that, and then I went from that straight to basically playing on the computer. So I never played in the N64.
It was a fun time. It looked terrible, but we thought it looked awesome.
Absolutely.
Going cross-eyed, sitting far from the CRT TV.
All right, awesome. So that does bring us to the end of an episode. But before we do, I always like to ask our guests that question in the name of our episodes, Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks, to give us one hack that's relevant to what we've been talking about today. So, what's your hack today?
Okay, so this is the first time I guess I'm on this show. What are the criteria for that hack? Is it a software hack?
It's whatever you want to be. The idea is that we leave it wide open, but the idea is it's something that is relevant to what we talked about today, that you think could help other people to improve something. So that's my definition of a hack.
Okay, let's see. Well, to be honest with you, all of my time these days are spent inside of the editor in Rhino. So I guess that's the closest thing that I have in mind to a hack. That if you have always been curious about like playing with geometry in Python and want to run your machine learning models on a 3D geometry and explore those kind of ideas and that's kind of stuff. Rhino 8 has a good infrastructure to try that out. You can install like PyTorch and NumPy and SciPy and all those kind of stuff in there. It's gonna be buggy. It's got, you know, some bugs and all that kind of stuff, but we're working on a daily basis to get those resolved and, you know, make it available for everybody. I'm really trying hard to think of a better hack.
I think that's pretty good, and I think the idea of having it out there, the editor, when and as you, the one of the people behind it keeps saying buggy, but I think the idea of getting it out there at that stage, it allows people the ability to play with it, and you may get feedback and ideas, even if they are in the form of a bug report, that's going to lead you down a path that you would have never thought of.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like when I started this, me and Steve were talking about it, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to change something that's been out there for 15 years, but the reality is that during the lifetime of Rhino 8, this needs to mature. Because the moment this is out, people are going to be like, hey, they broke like 20 things that I had no idea before that. So there's no way you can actually remove all these bugs without putting it out there.
Yeah. So I think that's your hack. Sometimes you just got to jump in with both feet.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If I guess this is if I learned one thing inside of McGill is that the moment you created a tool and you're like, you know, this solve this right problem in front of me, just put it down there and see what other ways people can use it and see if it's even people want it or not. Sometimes you make this thing and you're like, it's really cool, and you put it in front of people and they're like, yeah, nobody has a use for it. So it stops you from spending too much time on it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to bring the plane in for the landing, as I like to say. But before I officially go into my closing speech, I will check with John to see if he has any final questions, so we don't have to do any re-edits like last time.
No, I think I'm all good. That was a lot of really good information. We got in the weeds too, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I like to, you know, nerd on electronics and software and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And that's the other thing about this, is that we're not just here to talk about technology for designing building. It's a little bit of everything. So I like the geek aspect of it. And with that, we will bring this plane in for a landing. And I thank you all for joining us for another episode of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks, where we explore tools, technologies, time-saving hacks that are shaping the future. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, again, somewhere down here, and stay tuned for more insights into the exciting world of AECO technology. Until next time, keep building, innovating, and exploring the possibilities.